This week, something you can always give away but means nothing and is worth nothing until it is given away. What could it be? Then, we'll take one author who penned a history of Freemasonry as he thought about it in 1938, quoting from several authors, one of which doesn't have the greatest track record. But is his synopsis of Freemasonry in America and its foundations accurate at all? You decide. We'll read an awesome piece from the Philalethes from back in 1938 called The Freemasonry in America. All this and more, stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back to the show. This is episode number 664. My thanks goes out to the contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. It is through your support that we can make this show every single week, every month, every year, to get that Masonic knowledge into the hands of those all over the world with an interest in Freemasonry and its kindred sciences. If you'd like to know more about how you can help support this program, head on over to our website, wcypodcast.com. Click on Support the Show and check out the various options available. We also have a shop and a number of other projects, and just know that anything we link back to on the WCY podcast website all goes right back into the production of this show and Masonic education. So, thank you so much for your consideration. Presentations coming up. We've got quite the upcoming February. Nothing in January, but February 20th, I will be in Silver Lake, Kansas, which is just west of Topeka. I'll be doing a presentation on Freemasonry in America and its colonial tavern beginnings. And then the very next day, I'll actually be flying and doing a premiere lecture at the Illumination Lecture Series for South Pasadena Masonic Lodge on, again, Friday the 21st. The title of the presentation is called Mystical Legacies, Unveiling the Esoteric Origins and Historical Implications of Atlantis, Lemuria, and the Master Race in Occult Traditions. The presentation will embark on an explorative journey into the mythological realms of Atlantis and Lemuria, examining their significance within esoteric orders and theosophical societies. We'll delve into the romanticized narratives propagated by such traditions where ancient, advanced civilizations allegedly laid the foundations for a master race, a concept that's been perpetuated throughout history and has found an unsettling place in occult doctrines. Again, it will be a premiere presentation, the first time I'll ever be giving this one, and of course it will pave the way for some later work that we'll be doing, exploring occult traditions and which occult traditions have influenced Freemasonry, and of course a tie back to some of the beliefs of those organizations, the extremisms, etc. So, that out of the way, I wanted to read a great piece this week that comes from the Philalethes Society from back in April of 1938. Now, I'll be reading this from the paper, so if you hear a little bit of rustling, as usual, that is, of course, just the pages. So here we go. The Real Story of Freemasonry by Cyrus Field Willard. We in America have a very vague idea of the real history of Freemasonry and the origin of the various rites about which the Square and Compass has been publishing a series of articles by Dr. Cummings and Brother St. Clair. It is not to be wondered at that we in America have but a vague idea of what happened in England before we were a nation, and when powerful interests were active in trying to suppress the facts and were giving but little information about the events as they actually occurred. No matter how we got them, what is said herein cannot affect the beautiful rites and ennobling ethical teachings that are conveyed by them. It is said that we get our Freemasonry from England, where the first speculative Grand Lodge of England was formed in 1717, and Anthony Sayer was elected Grand Master. This was declared by Dr. James Anderson in his History of the Grand Lodge of England and contained in the constitutions of that body, which were printed in 1723, 6 years later after the Grand Lodge was formed. It is generally admitted in England and elsewhere today that our present Freemasonry came down from the operative Freemasons, organized in guilds. But the soft pedal is on in England now as to how it came over, and much digging is necessary to get into the fact. These operative Masons had their local bodies, which they called lodges, because they were a band of skilled architects and builders who were lodged in rough buildings near the beautiful cathedrals and abbeys they erected. The reason why nothing much is said in England, and why there has been such a question as to whether there were 2 or 3 degrees in the beginning, is easy to see when the facts are known as to how the secrets, laws, and ritual of the ancient Freemasons came into the possession of the Grand Lodge of England. So its constitutions were printed in 1723. There are 2 books, which should be read by every member of the Masonic fraternity if he wishes the whole story of how this was done in all its details, and which will give him an entirely new light of knowledge and truth as to the origin of Freemasonry, as we now have it, with its glorious ethical teachings, which inculcate universal brotherhood, as it was taught in the ancient mysteries, of which our fraternity is a mutilated remnant. The first is by Dr. Charles M. Merz, editor of the Masonic Bulletin of Sandusky, Ohio, entitled Guild Masonry in the Making, and was published in 1918. The other is entitled The Arcane Schools by John Yarker, and was published in 1905. In it, Yarker shows the existence of various rites in the operative lodges in England, Ireland, and Scotland, and the descent of these through the Roman and Comocene masonries from Egypt, Greece, and Etruria. Dr. Merz shows the constitution of these Masonic guilds with 7 degrees, which we now have with 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge and 4 degrees of the Red Lodge, or chapter of the Royal Arch. We read about Anderson being ordered to digest the old Gothic constitutions, which he did, and they were ordered to be printed in the constitutions of 1723, taking 6 years to quote-unquote digest it, so he could take over the degrees of the operatives. Dr. Merz tells that the doctor who examined the apprentice and the chaplain did not have to pay any dues or entrance money, and the Reverend Dr. Anderson was appointed chaplain of the operative lodge in 1710. Yarker confirms this in his book by saying Dr. James Anderson was made chaplain of St. Paul's Guild in 1710, in succession to Dr. Compton, who had been in the habit of holding a daily service. In 1714, Dr. Anderson proposed that, quote-unquote, men of position should be admitted to a species of honorary membership, which was carried by only 1 vote, and accounts in that, and the following year, show that 7 fees of 5 guineas each were paid. All the time the work on St. Paul's Cathedral was in operation under Sir Christopher Wren, the members met at High 12 Saturday in the lodge that was large enough for the drafting rooms and the meeting hall of the 7 degrees and offices of the 3 Grand Masters. Merz gives a diagram showing the layout of the lodge. Anderson, so Yarker says, changed the time and place of the meeting from the lodge of St. Paul's Churchyard at High 12 Saturday to the Goose and Gridiron Tavern at 7 o'clock Wednesday evening. The operatives found that their password would not admit them, and they complained to Sir Christopher Wren and Strong in September 1715, and the dissidents were struck off the rolls. Dr. Merz says that Anderson was expelled in 1715, but does not give the date. Yarker says that this is probably why Anderson complained that Wren neglected the lodges. Under such circumstances, no honorable man can say Anderson acted a creditable part. But we can see what he actually digested. He made the apprentice in a month instead of 7 years, and struck out everything technical, including the ceremonies of conferring the mark master, and left a fine moral institution on the lines of the mystic societies of the ancients. But it was not Freemasonry, only an imitation of it. He retained as much of the old rite as suited his purpose, and he could remember, and which could be worked into the new system, but it lacked the explanations that the guild rites afforded. Among those expelled were Anthony Sayer, so Dr. Merz says, as he was employed in the drafting room, and he got in bad with the new Grand Lodge, later for similar work. Yarker shows that the Athelstan Constitution actually existed as a written document and was in the possession of one of the Northern Operative Lodges at one time and is similar to the Regis and Cook manuscripts. Dr. Mers gives the description of the operative lodges and their 7 degrees, where the 3 masters sit in the west, where they can see the rising sun. The junior warden sits in the north, so he can see the sun at the meridian height, and the senior warden sits in the east, to see the sun in the west at the close of the day. Much to the surprise of the writer, Yarker proves that the Knights Templar and Royal Arch degrees were found among the operative guilds. Heretofore, the writer had smiled at the idea of Protestant Masons in America fervently advocating a degree which was formulated by a good Roman Catholic, Chevalier Michael Andrew Ramsay, as I have shown in the articles in the Square and Compass and the Masonic Craftsman. But Yarker shows that these degrees were practiced by the operative Masons of England, Scotland, and Ireland long before the Scotch Presbyterian minister Anderson came down to London to become the chaplain of the operative lodge in St. Paul's Churchyard in 1710. Yarker traces with care the progress of the builders' mysteries from Egypt, page 80 of Morals and Dogma. Yarker shows these mysteries proceeded from Egypt to the Masons who built the temples that were the glory of Greece, and thence to Rome, where they were taken up by the collegia instituted by Numa Pompilius, who had been initiated in the Etruscan mysteries, thence to Como in Lombardy, governed by Gothic kings, whence the so-called Gothic architecture, and thence to France, England, and Scotland. The Masonic guilds had square masons and arch masons, one arch mason guild being connected with the Lodge of St. Paul's. Quote, in 1190, Bishop Jocelyn obtained a charter from William the Lion to establish a fraternity to assist in raising funds to erect the cathedral at Glasgow. The same bishop undertook the creation of the Abbey of Kilwinning. The Templar Preceptory of Red Abbey Steed was erected at the same time, and an ancient lodge of Masons existed there until last century. End quote, said Yarker in 1905. This statement of the Abbey of Kilwinning being erected in 1190 seems to verify the statement of Ramsay in his celebrated oration that James, the Grand Steward of Scotland, was master of a lodge at Kilwinning in 1286, for Ramsay was born at Ayr, a short distance from Kilwinning, so he knew. It does not seem to be known to the author of the article about Ramsay in the New Gould's History of Freemasonry that Ramsay was initiated in the Lodge of Antiquity in London in 1730, when he received his degree of Doctor of Civil Law from Oxford. Yarker says that the Templars built their Domus Dei, or House of God, at Dover in the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272. The writer has always believed that Ramsay had some source of information for the statements he made to the Grand Lodge of France, which are not now in existence. He said that it was the son of this king, Henry III, who, as Edward I of England, brought back with him from the Crusades the Masons who would not be safe in Palestine after the Crusaders had been defeated by Saladin. After Ramsay had been made a DCL by Oxford University and a member of the Royal Society, and had been made a Mason in that same year, Gould says he went to visit the Protestant Duke of Argyll, with whom he stayed 5 years. Now Ayr and Kilwinning are under that Scottish lord, and being a Mason now, he would not fail to visit the Lodge of Kilwinning of the operatives, which must have existed to build the Abbey of Kilwinning in 1190. If it existed when Ramsay visited in 1730 or 35, as it did after the Grand Lodge of Scotland was formed in 1736, when the Lodge of Kilwinning had a quarrel over its claim to superior antiquity over the Edinburgh Lodge of Mary's Chapel. It was then in 1735 that he could have and did no doubt learned what he said in his oration of 1737 about the Knights Templar seeking shelter among the Masonic lodges of Palestine. We know that noblemen made part of the operatives by the minutes of Mary's Chapel of 1599, when a Scottish laird signed the record of the meeting with his mark, as any operative would do. On page 429, he says that Aberdeen was the seat of Masonic Templary. Yarker says on that page that, quote, when the lands Mary Coulter were surrendered in 1548, the knights took up their residence in the city where an old lodge existed and embraced the noble and simple. End quote. And we find the lodge meeting in tents as encampments, hence designated as Outfield Lodge, and hence believed to have included Templar rites which were based on Gnosticism, for which Gnostic trait Clement V and Philip of France suppressed them. But these Gnostic rites were far from the modern ideas of what constitutes Christianity. Yarker traces a connection between the Chaldee Christians, opposed to Rome, and the Templars. He says that the Chaldee form of Christianity resisted all the efforts of Rome, and continued in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland until the Norman conquest. He says that the peculiarities of the Chaldee system was probably due to the engrafting of Druidical beliefs on the Christian faith. His statements, while quite learned, are too long to be given here. Enough has been given to show that the Templar rites were taken up by the early operative Masons, who included architects and sculptors of great skill and artists of merit from the East. Rabold tells us in his History of the Three Grand Lodges that Dr. Ramsay, a Scotchman, introduced in 1736 a rite of 7 degrees into French Freemasonry that met as a chapter of Clermont, and afterwards developed into the Emperors of the East and West. This is the body that gave Stephen Morin his patent to introduce the rite of perfection to America. As soon as he set sail, he was captured by English and taken to London, where he sat in lodge with Earl Ferrers, the Grand Master of the Moderns, and so the rite of 7 degrees was carried back to London again. At that time, Lawrence Dermot was making his fight against the Moderns, as he justly termed the Anderson Grand Lodge, and helped by some of the old operatives, he called the Anderson crowd Moderns, and made it stick too. The ancients, Yarker says, were assisted by some of the old operatives, and Henry Sadler, in his Masonic Facts and Fiction, proves that Dermot's quote-unquote ancients were not seceders from the First Grand Lodge of 1717, but were Irish operative Masons. They beat out the Moderns when the United Grand Lodge was formed by the union of 2 Grand Lodges in 1813, which is quite modern. Not many years ago, Brother W. Wonnacott, Grand Librarian of the Grand Lodge of England, sent the writer proof sheets of an address he made to the Quattuor Coronati Lodge of Research, of which the writer was a member of the Correspondence Circle, in which he told of the finding of a minute book of the French Lodge St. George of Strict Observance, of which Lambert de Linot was the moving spirit, and which rite had been imported from France, and which was again the rite of 7 degrees. They were enumerated, and by the names included, all the similar names of the Scottish Rite, and what we in America term the York Rite. Wonnacott gave a list of a number of French lodges that practiced it, and, what is more important, said that these degrees were taken from London to the west of England and to Bristol, where Thomas Dunkerley took them up and was made head of the Knights Templar. From Bristol, they were carried across the Irish Channel to Dublin by Zimmerman and Fowler. Now these degrees of the Royal Arch and Knight Templar, and the degrees that became the Scottish Rite, were given in chapters of members of the Blue Lodges as they were given in the operative lodges, and they were so given by St. Andrew's Lodge of Boston in 1769, and they were given in the lodges of Pennsylvania, where the influence of the ancients predominated, and also in the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, which continued as an ancient Grand Lodge for 4 years after the 2 Grand Lodges of England had united. It was this Grand Lodge of South Carolina that, according to Dalcio, one of the organizers of the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree, organized the first Supreme Council as related in his orations and quoted in Mackey's Encyclopedia as revised by Clegg. It is easy to see that nothing would be allowed to come out in England about the expulsion of the digester of the old Gothic constitutions of the First Grand Lodge of England. But it could be published in America, and was, during the hubbub of the World War, so that not much attention was paid to it by the Masonic scholars at the time. Mers tells that the operatives had a commemorative ceremony in which a drama was performed somewhat like our third degree, and it was from this circumstance that we got our third degree, which has puzzled all students who have analyzed Anderson's statements. Yarker tells us that at the time the Templars built their Domus Dei at Dover, some facts which also seem to confirm what Ramsay said about Edward I bringing back Masons from Palestine by saying, quote, "It is also the commencement of a more finished style of pointed Gothic, introduced by the Masons returning from Palestine," end quote. He also tells us how the laymen emancipated themselves from the monasteries and came to the front as builders, and also that the quote-unquote Old Master's ceremony of York contained much that is now omitted and had many points of resemblance to the ancient mysteries, end quote. There is much connecting Freemasonry with the ancient mysteries, and it shows why with craftsmen of different religions, toleration was an absolute necessity. It is well to always remember that Freemasons brought back from Palestine many things which are now Masonic traditions, which are not to be lightly discarded as was done with the ceremonies of the Masters of York. There is a curious item on page 43 of Yarker's book. The Church of Santa Croce in Florence has over the main portal a figure of Christ holding in his hand a perfect square, and it was who told Peter that upon this stone I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Clavel states that the figure of Christ in the Church of St. Denis has the hand placed in a position well known to Freemasons. After reading the books by Yarker and Mers and articles pertaining to the various subjects of this paper in the Revised Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Robert I. Clegg, the reader will get an accurate picture of the origin of much of our present system of rites which we now have in America. Wow, good grief. I have to say, this particular piece was a little bit all over the place. I take some issue with quoting John Yarker almost at all. Yarker was kind of a wild man, a spinner of tales, but I will call this piece fun and entertaining. If you'd like to get a copy of it, again, it comes from the Philalethes, published back in 1938, and was pulled from the Square and Compass magazine, Denver, Colorado, Volume 47, Number 2. So check that out if you ever want to get a copy of it. Next up, quick piece that I found in another edition of the Square and Compass, a Journal of Masonry. This one coming from May of 1937, Volume 46, Number 2. And it's very short. It's called A Smile. A smile costs nothing, but gives much. It enriches those who receive without making poorer those who give it. It takes but a moment, but the memory of it sometimes lasts forever. No one is so high or mighty that he can get along without it, and no one is so poor but that he can be made rich by it. A smile creates happiness in the home, fosters goodwill in business, and is the countersign of friendship. A smile brings rest for the weary, cheer to the discouraged, and is nature's best antidote for trouble. Yet it cannot be bought, begged, or stolen, for it is of no value to anyone until it is given away. If you meet someone who is too tired to give you a smile, give him one of yours. Is it not he who gives most of his talents, really blessing humanity most? And that comes from the Scottish Rite's Son, reprinted here in the Square and Compass magazine. I love this bit. I think it is probably something that could be memorized and given to interested parties in Masonry to sort of describe the type of brotherhood we have. Anyway, I would give you all a smile right now. Anyway, that's all for this week. I hope you guys had a great week and you're getting along well and the new year is treating you well. If you have any questions about the episodes or anything at all, just know that you can always reach out to me at my email address, admin@wcypodcast.com. There's also forms on the website that will allow you to contact me if you need to for Any reason at all. Again, hope you enjoyed. My thanks goes out one more time to our producers, fellows, contributors, and legacy partners of this program. Without you, I can't make it. You mean the world to me, and it means the world to me that we can continue to make this available to all those who have an interest. Well, that's it. And until next week, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.
WCY Media.
Why, that's me, man.